The peaceful Saturday morning shattered like glass under the relentless grating buzz of someone hammering our gate buzzer. Nails on a chalkboard couldn't have been worse. Startled, I glanced up from my coffee, my heart skipping as the sharp, angry rhythm pierced the calm. Through the front window, I spotted a woman in an oversized blazer pacing like a caged lion at our community's entrance gate, phone glued to her ear while her free hand slashed the air with wild gestures. "This is completely unacceptable." Her voice sliced through the distance, sharp and commanding. "I am a member of this HOA board and have every legal right to access this property for inspection purposes. If you people don't open this gate immediately, I'm calling 911 to report a security threat." My wife, Sarah, looked up from her laptop, where she'd been buried in paperwork despite her leave from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Old habits die hard. Her eyebrows arched slightly as she took in the drama unfolding at our gate. "Looks like Margaret's at it again," she said, her voice steady and cool, honed from years as a federal agent. "Margaret Henderson." Just the name was enough to make half our neighborhood groan in unison. She'd clawed her way onto our homeowners association board 6 months ago and had been turning lives upside down ever since. What began as petty gripes about mailbox colors had spiraled into full-blown property inspections, violation notices for the most absurd infractions, and threats of legal action against anyone brave enough to challenge her growing authoritarian grip on our community guidelines. Just last week, she'd slapped us with a violation. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any confrontations with the HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. Notice to the elderly couple next door because their garden gnome was allegedly 1 inch too tall, according to the decorative ornament clause. The week before that, she tried to find another neighbor for parking their car in their own driveway at what she deemed an aesthetically displeasing angle. The woman had completely lost perspective on what reasonable community standards looked like. Sarah and I had been living in Meadowbrook Commons for 3 years now. It was supposed to be our quiet retreat. From the chaos of our respective careers, I worked in corporate consulting, traveling frequently for client meetings, while Sarah had dedicated the last decade of her life to federal law enforcement. She'd requested extended leave after wrapping up a particularly intense case involving interstate fraud, and we'd been looking forward to some much-needed downtime together. The community had always been peaceful before Margaret's arrival. Sure, we had reasonable rules about lawn maintenance and noise levels, but they were enforced with common sense and neighborly consideration. Margaret had transformed simple guidelines into a complex web of regulations that she wielded like weapons against anyone who crossed her path or questioned her authority. "I'm serious about calling the police." Margaret's voice grew louder, though she was still speaking into her phone rather than addressing us directly. "These people are clearly hiding something if they won't allow a legitimate HOA inspection. This could be a matter of community safety." Sarah closed her laptop and stood up, stretching slightly. "You know what's interesting about this situation?" she said, walking toward the window to get a better view. "Margaret's not actually scheduled for any inspections today. I checked the HOA calendar yesterday, and there's nothing on there about property visits this weekend." I joined her at the window watching as Margaret continued her theatrical performance at our gate. She'd now pulled out a small notebook and appeared to be taking detailed notes about our property from her vantage point. At the entrance, her car was parked sideways across 2 visitor spaces, blocking anyone else from using the guest parking area. Plus, Sarah continued, "According to our community bylaws, HOA board members are required to provide 72 hours written notice before conducting any property inspections, and they need to have a specific violation complaint filed first. You can't just show up and demand access because you feel like playing property police." The buzzer assault continued for another few minutes before Margaret apparently gave up on getting our attention that way. Instead, she pulled out her cell phone and began dialing with exaggerated, deliberate movements, making sure we could see her through the gates. Decorative iron work. "This is it," she announced, loudly, as if we were her intended audience. "I'm calling 911 right now to report suspicious activity and potential community safety violations. Maybe the police can get these people to cooperate with a legitimate HOA inspection." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, taking on that focused intensity I'd learned to recognize during our marriage. It was the same look she got when reviewing case files or preparing for important operations. "Well, this should be interesting," she murmured, glancing at her phone as it began to ring during her leave from the FBI. Sarah had been picking up occasional shifts with the county's 911 dispatch center. They'd been short-staffed for months, and her law enforcement background made her an ideal candidate for helping manage emergency calls during peak times. She'd mentioned just yesterday that she was on the volunteer schedule for this weekend. Sarah Martinez, Emergency Dispatch. She answered her phone in her professional voice while simultaneously moving toward our front door. I watched through the window as Margaret began speaking rapidly into her own phone, gesturing dramatically toward our house. The irony of the situation was almost too perfect. Margaret, in her infinite wisdom and complete ignorance, had just called 911 to report suspicious activity at a property owned by an off-duty FBI agent, and that same FBI agent was the person assigned to take her emergency call. Sarah listened quietly for nearly 2 minutes, occasionally making small acknowledgement sounds. While Margaret continued her animated performance at our gate, I could see our neighbor growing increasingly frustrated as she apparently wasn't getting the immediate response she'd expected from her emergency call. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down and provide specific details about the nature of this emergency," Sarah said into her phone, while catching my eye and giving me a subtle hand signal. It meant I should start recording what was happening outside. "Are you reporting an immediate threat to life or property?" Through the window, I watched Margaret's posture stiffen. "Yes, absolutely there's a threat," she declared loudly enough for us to hear. "Clearly these residents are refusing to comply with legitimate HOA authority, and I have reason to believe they may be hiding dangerous or illegal activities inside their home. They won't allow a scheduled property inspection, which suggests they have something to hide." Sarah's eyebrows raised again, and she put her phone on mute for a moment. "She's claiming this was a scheduled inspection and that we're being suspicious by not allowing access," she told me quietly. "She's also suggesting we might be engaged in illegal activities because we won't open our door to her unannounced weekend visit." This was escalating far beyond typical HOA drama, making false reports to emergency services was a serious offense, and Margaret was apparently too wrapped up in her power trip to realize the legal implications of her statements. Sarah unmuted her phone and continued with the call. "I'm going to need you to remain calm and stay at your current location," Sarah instructed in her official dispatcher voice. "A patrol unit will be responding to assess the situation. Please do not attempt to enter the property or escalate the conflict while waiting for law enforcement to arrive." But Margaret was clearly beyond listening to reasonable instructions. As Sarah was wrapping up the emergency call, I watched our HOA board member march back to her car and start pulling items out of her trunk. She emerged with a clipboard, a camera, and what appeared to be an official-looking folder stuffed with papers. "She's not planning to wait for police," I told Sarah as she finished the call and immediately began dialing another number. "Looks like she's gearing up for some kind of confrontation." Sarah nodded while her second call connected. "This is Agent Martinez, badge number 7492, she said. I need to report a situation at my home address that requires immediate patrol response. A civilian is making false emergency reports and may be preparing to trespass on federal agent property." The speed with which things developed next was almost surreal. Within minutes I heard the sound of a car engine revving outside, followed by the screech of tires and the crash of metal against metal racing back to the window. I saw that Margaret had attempted to follow another resident through our automatic gate and had clipped the back bumper of their car in her haste to get inside our community. The other driver, an elderly gentleman named Frank, who lived 2 streets over, had stopped his car and was climbing out to inspect the damage. Margaret, meanwhile, had successfully made it through the gate and was now marching up our driveway with her clipboard and camera, apparently unconcerned about the minor traffic accident she'd just caused. "Margaret Henderson, HO, a board member," she announced loudly as she approached our front door, speaking as if she were addressing a formal meeting. "I'm here to conduct a mandatory property inspection for violations of community standards. I have documented evidence of unauthorized patio furniture and landscaping modifications that violate our established guidelines." Sarah opened our front door and stepped outside, her FBI credentials clearly visible on the lanyard around her neck. Her posture was relaxed but alert, the stance of someone comfortable with confrontation and trained to de-escalate tense situations. "Ma'am, you're currently trespassing on private property," Sarah said calmly. "You do not have permission to be here. You did not provide required advance notice for any inspection, and you've just made false statements to emergency services. I'm going to need you to return to the street immediately." Margaret's confident expression faltered for just a moment as she took in Sarah's credentials, but her sense of entitlement quickly reasserted itself. "I don't care what kind of badge you think you have," she snapped. "Oit authority supersedes individual property rights within this community. I have every legal right to inspect this property for violations, and your refusal to cooperate is evidence of non-compliance, actually." "That's completely incorrect," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional tone. "HOA inspection rights are limited by state law and require proper notice and documentation. More importantly, making false reports to 911 is a misdemeanor offense, and trespassing on federal property can carry additional charges." The sound of approaching sirens was becoming audible. In the distance, Margaret seemed to realize that the situation was not developing according to her script, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her aggressive approach. "You people think you're above the rules," she declared, raising her camera to start taking pictures of our house. "Well, I'm documenting everything, and the HOA board will be taking legal action against this household for non-compliance and obstruction of legitimate community oversight." Sarah stepped forward slightly, her movement subtle but clearly positioning herself between Margaret and our front door. "Ma'am, I'm instructing you one final time to leave this property immediately. You are trespassing. You have made false statements to emergency services, and you are now threatening legal action based on fabricated violations. The patrol units that are about to arrive will be provided with a full recording of your 911 call and documentation of your behavior. 2 police cruisers turned onto our street at that moment, their emergency lights flashing but sirens now silent." Margaret spun around to face them, her whole demeanor shifting as she apparently prepared to present herself as the victim in this situation. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she called out as the first patrol car pulled into our driveway behind her vehicle. "These residents have been completely uncooperative with a legitimate HOA inspection, and I believe they may be hiding illegal activities inside their home." The first officer to approach was a tall woman with sergeant's stripes who looked like she'd been handling domestic disputes for years. She glanced at Sarah's credentials, then at Margaret's dramatic posture, and I could see her immediately assessing the real dynamics of the situation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." The sergeant said to Margaret, "and I'd like you to step away from the residence while we sort out what's happening here." "I'm Margaret Henderson, HOA board member," Margaret replied, pulling out her driver's license with exaggerated compliance. "I was conducting a routine property inspection when these people became hostile and refused to cooperate. The woman claims to be some kind of federal agent, but I think she's impersonating law enforcement to intimidate me," the sergeant examined. Margaret's identification then walked over to speak with Sarah. Their conversation was quiet, but I could see Sarah showing additional credentials and what appeared to be official documentation. After a few minutes, the sergeant nodded and returned. "To Margaret, Mrs. Henderson, I've reviewed the 911 call you made approximately 20 minutes ago," the sergeant said, consulting her notepad. "In that call, you reported suspicious activity and suggested that the residents might be engaged in illegal behavior. However, Agent Martinez has provided documentation showing that you did not follow proper HOA procedures for property inspections, and you do not have legal authority to enter this property." Margaret's face was beginning to flush red. "That's ridiculous," she protested. "Oh, board members have full inspection rights within the community. These people are clearly trying to hide something, or they would have cooperated with a simple inspection request." Additionally, the sergeant continued, "Forcing entry through the community gate behind another vehicle without permission constitutes trespassing, and making false statements in a 911 call is a misdemeanor offense under state law." The second officer had been taking photographs of Margaret's car positioning and the minor damage to Frank's vehicle, where she'd clipped his bumper. During her aggressive entry through the gate, Frank himself had walked over and was now speaking with the first officer about pressing charges for the hit-and-run aspect of Margaret's behavior. "This is completely unfair." Margaret's voice was rising to a near shout. "I'm being targeted because I'm trying to enforce community standards that these people think they're too good to follow. I demand to speak with your supervisor, and I want that woman's credentials verified because I don't believe she's really a federal agent." Sarah remained calm throughout Margaret's outburst, occasionally exchanging glances with the sergeant, who was clearly experienced in dealing with entitled individuals who believed their perceived authority exempted them from normal laws and social conventions. "Mrs. Henderson," the sergeant said firmly, "you're going to need to turn around and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for trespassing, misuse of emergency services, and leaving the scene of a traffic accident." The transformation in Margaret's demeanor was instantaneous and dramatic. Her authoritative posturing crumbled as the reality of her situation became clear. "You can't arrest me," she stammered. "I'm on the HOA board. I was just doing my job. These people are the ones breaking the rules." But the handcuffs were already clicking into place as neighbors began emerging from their houses to witness the spectacle. Mrs. Chen from across the street had her phone out and was clearly recording the entire arrest. The young couple from the corner house were standing in their driveway, watching with obvious satisfaction as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer finally faced consequences for her behavior. "This is harassment," Margaret continued protesting as she was guided toward the patrol car. "I'm going to file complaints against all of you. The HOA board will hear about this, and there will be consequences for targeting a board member who was just trying to maintain community standards." Sarah walked over to the sergeant and handed her a folder. "This contains documentation of Mrs. Henderson's pattern of HOA violations over the past 6 months. She explained harassment of elderly residents, improper inspection procedures, abuse of board authority, and multiple complaints filed by community members. I compiled it last week after she issued that ridiculous violation notice to the Pattersons for their garden gnome." The sergeant flipped through the documentation, her expression growing more serious as she read. "This is quite a pattern," she commented. "Have other residents been documenting these incidents? 15 households have filed Formal complaints with the property management company, Sarah replied, but Margaret's been using her board position to suppress them and retaliate against anyone who challenges her authority. This morning's incident with the false 911 call was just the final escalation as Margaret was placed in the back of the patrol car, still protesting her innocence and demanding to speak with various supervisors and authorities. Frank approached us to thank Sarah for handling the situation professionally. "That woman has been making everyone's life miserable," he said, shaking his head. "She issued me a violation notice last month because my newspaper was delivered 15 minutes before the acceptable morning hours. According to some rules she made up, the sergeant finished her paperwork and came over to speak with Sarah one final time. Agent Martinez will need you to come in next week to provide a formal statement for the charges we're filing, given her pattern of behavior and the false emergency report. The district attorney will probably pursue this pretty aggressively." As the patrol cars drove away with Margaret in custody, an odd quiet settled over our street neighbors who had been hiding behind curtains and watching from windows, began to venture outside, creating an impromptu gathering as people shared their own Margaret Henderson horror stories. It turned out that nearly everyone had been dealing with her escalating behavior, but most had felt powerless to challenge someone who claimed official HOA authority. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman with the allegedly oversized garden gnome, thanked Sarah repeatedly for finally standing up to Margaret's bullying tactics. Within an hour, word had spread throughout the entire community. People were texting and calling each other, sharing the news that Margaret Henderson had been arrested for harassment and false reporting. The relief in people's voices was unmistakable as they realized they wouldn't have to deal with her arbitrary rule enforcement and threatening behavior anymore. Sarah settled back onto our couch with her coffee, which had long since gone cold during the morning's excitement. She looked satisfied, but not triumphant, like someone who had simply done what needed to be done rather than seeking any kind of personal victory. "You know what the best part about this whole situation is?" she said, glancing out at our patio furniture that had supposedly violated Margaret's interpretation of community standards. "I never even had to use my federal authority or pull rank. She created this entire situation herself through her own illegal behavior." The phone started ringing almost immediately as news of Margaret's arrest spread through the community. The first call was from Janet Morrison, the HOA president, who wanted to schedule an emergency board meeting to discuss Margaret's removal from her position. Apparently this morning's incident was just the excuse they'd been waiting for to address months of complaints about her conduct. By evening we learned that Margaret Henderson had been formally removed from the HOA board pending resolution of her criminal charges. The property management company had also launched an internal investigation into her abuse of inspection procedures and harassment of residents. Several neighbors were planning to pursue civil action for the stress and financial costs her baseless violation notices had caused them. Sarah spent the evening on our porch reviewing case files from her FBI work while sipping fresh coffee and watching the sunset paint our neighborhood in peaceful golden light. The same patio furniture that had supposedly warranted emergency police intervention sat exactly where it had always been, causing no harm to anyone except Margaret. Henderson's inflated sense of authority. For the first time in months, Meterbrook Commons felt like the quiet, friendly community we'd originally chosen as our home. No one was afraid of arbitrary violation notices or surprise inspections. No one was walking on eggshells around a self-appointed neighborhood dictator who had confused having a title with having unlimited power. Margaret Henderson had called 911, expecting to use police authority to enforce her personal interpretation of community rules. Instead, she discovered that actual law enforcement takes false reporting seriously and that federal agents don't respond well to harassment and intimidation tactics. Her attempt to abuse the emergency system had backfired spectacularly, landing her in jail and ending her reign of suburban tyranny. In a single morning, the neighborhood was quiet. For weeks afterward, people gradually stopped looking over their shoulders when they checked their mail or worked in their gardens no longer. Worried about arbitrary violations or surprise inspections, the HOA returned to its original purpose of maintaining reasonable community standards rather than serving as Margaret's personal enforcement agency. Sarah continued picking up occasional shifts with the 911 dispatch center, though she joked that she hoped never again to receive an emergency call about her own property from someone trying to break into her house. The irony of Margaret's situation had become legendary among the dispatch. Staff who used it as a training example of how false reporting can escalate minor disputes into serious criminal charges. The following Tuesday, Sarah received a call from Detective Williams at the county prosecutor's office, Margaret Henderson's. Case had taken an interesting turn that nobody could have predicted during the processing of her arrest. A background check had revealed several outstanding warrants in neighboring counties for similar incidents involving harassment and false reporting. Apparently, your Margaret has been pulling this same routine in at least 3 other communities over the past 2 years, Detective Williams explained during their phone conversation. She joins HOA boards, abuses her authority to harass residents, and when people push back, she escalates to involving law enforcement with fabricated complaints. Sarah listened with growing amazement as the detective outlined Margaret's pattern of behavior in Riverside Estates. She'd been removed from the HOA board after filing over 50 violation notices in a single month, targeting families with children and elderly residents who couldn't easily fight back. In Sunset Ridge, she'd actually been banned from community meetings after threatening to call Child Protective Services on parents whose children played too loudly in their own backyards. The most interesting case was in Willowbrook Village. Detective Williams continued, she convinced the other board members to hire a private security company to patrol the community, then tried to give the guards authority to enter people's homes for safety inspections. When residents complained, she filed reports claiming they were running illegal businesses or hiding dangerous activities. The pattern was becoming clear. Margaret Henderson wasn't just an overzealous volunteer who'd gotten carried away with HOA rules. She was someone who systematically sought out positions of minor authority, specifically so she could harass and intimidate people who couldn't easily fight back. Our community had simply been her latest target. What's going to happen with the charges? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer given Margaret's apparent history of this behavior. With her record and the clear pattern of abuse, the prosecutor is treating this as a serious case. Detective Williams replied, the false reporting charge alone carries up to 6 months in jail, but combined with the harassment pattern and the federal property trespassing, we're looking at significant consequences. Plus, the other communities are now reopening their cases against her. That afternoon, Janet Morrison called to update us on the HOA board's response to Margaret's arrest and the subsequent revelations about her background. The emergency board meeting had been quite dramatic, apparently, as members realized how completely they'd been manipulated by Margaret's claims of legal authority and community expertise. She presented herself as having extensive experience with HOA management when she applied for the board position. Janet explained, sounding exhausted and embarrassed. She had all these official forms and legal documents that made her seem incredibly knowledgeable about community governance. We thought we were lucky to have someone so dedicated and informed. It turned out that Margaret's extensive experience had been gained through her pattern of joining HOA boards, causing chaos, and then moving on before facing serious consequences. She'd perfected a system of appearing professional and authoritative while gradually escalating her harassment of residents, until communities either gave in to her demands or she was forced to leave. The worst part is how many people she hurt before anyone realized what was happening. Janet continued, "The Pattersons are talking about selling their house because of the stress. She caused them. The young family on Maple Street actually considered moving rather than dealing with her constant violation notices and threats." Sarah and I spent that evening going through the documentation she'd compiled about Margaret's behavior, cross-referencing it with the new information from Detective Williams about her activities in other communities. The scope of Margaret's systematic harassment was staggering when viewed as a complete picture rather than isolated incidents. In every community, she'd followed the same playbook, joined the HOA board by presenting herself as experienced and dedicated, gradually escalate enforcement of existing rules, while creating new interpretations that gave her more authority. Target vulnerable residents who were less likely to fight back effectively, use threats of legal action and law enforcement involvement to intimidate anyone who challenged her authority. She's basically been running a neighborhood-level protection racket, Sarah observed, reviewing the pattern of behavior across multiple communities. Pay the fines, follow her arbitrary rules, don't question her authority or face escalating harassment and threats. The phone rang again around 8 that evening. This time it was Mrs. Chen from across the street calling to let us know that a local news reporter had been asking questions around the neighborhood about Margaret's arrest. Apparently word of the story had reached the media, and they were interested in the broader pattern of HOA abuse that Margaret represented. The reporter said they've been investigating problems with HOA governance for months. Mrs. Chan explained, "Your situation is apparently just one example of a much bigger problem with people abusing these positions to harass their neighbors. They want to interview residents about their experiences with Margaret Sarah, and I discussed whether to participate in any media coverage. On one hand, publicity might help other communities recognize similar patterns of abuse before they escalated to criminal behavior. On the other hand, we'd prefer to let the legal system handle Margaret's case without turning it into a public spectacle. I think the most important thing is that people understand this wasn't just about HOA rules." Sarah said this was about someone systematically abusing a position of trust to harass and intimidate people in their own homes. The HOA aspect is just the mechanism she used. By Thursday, the story had indeed made the local news, though not in the sensationalized way we'd feared. The reporter had done their homework, interviewing residents from multiple communities where Margaret had operated and focusing on the broader issue of accountability in homeowner association governance. The news segment featured interviews with the Pattersons about their experience with the garden gnome violation notice, Frank discussing the incident with his newspaper delivery timing, and several residents from Margaret's previous communities describing similar patterns of harassment and abuse of authority. What made this situation particularly dangerous, the reporter concluded, is that Miss Henderson's behavior escalated to filing false police reports when residents began to resist her authority. This represents a serious abuse of emergency services that could have diverted resources from legitimate emergencies. The segment also featured an interview with a legal expert who explained the limited authority that HOA boards actually possess and how residents can protect themselves from similar abuse. It was educational rather than exploitative, focusing on community empowerment rather than personal drama. Margaret's arraignment was scheduled for the following week. According to Detective Williams, she'd hired an attorney who was apparently trying to negotiate a plea deal that would avoid jail time in exchange for restitution to affected communities and a prohibition on serving in any HOA capacity. In the future, her lawyer is arguing that she genuinely believed she had the authority to conduct these inspections and file these reports, Detective Williams told Sarah during their follow-up conversation, but given her pattern across multiple Communities, it's hard to believe this was just a misunderstanding of HOA rules. The prosecutor's office was also investigating whether Margaret had committed fraud by misrepresenting her qualifications and experience when applying for HOA board positions, if she'd knowingly provided false information about her background that could result in additional charges beyond the harassment and false reporting. Meanwhile, our community was adjusting to life without Margaret's constant interference. The difference was remarkable, and immediate people were working in their gardens without looking over their shoulders. Children were playing outside without their parents worrying about noise complaints. The elderly residents were checking their mail without fear of arbitrary violation notices. The HOA board had also implemented new procedures to prevent similar problems in the future. Board candidates would now undergo background checks, and there were new limits on individual members' authority to issue violation notices or conduct property inspections. Most importantly, residents now had a clear appeals process for challenging HOA decisions. We realized that we'd essentially given Margaret carte blanche to interpret and enforce rules however she wanted, Janet Morrison admitted during a community meeting. The following week, there were no checks on her authority, no oversight of her decisions, and no easy way for residents to challenge her actions. That's not how community governance should work. The meeting also addressed the financial impact of Margaret's behavior. Several families had incurred legal costs trying to fight her baseless violation notices. Others had spent money on unnecessary modifications to their properties to comply with her arbitrary interpretations of community standards. The HOA voted to establish a fund to help reimburse these costs. Where possible, Sarah continued working her occasional shifts with the 911 dispatch center, where Margaret's case had become something of a training example. New dispatchers were taught to recognize the signs of false reporting and harassment calls, and to document these incidents carefully for potential prosecution. The interesting thing about your case, the dispatch supervisor told Sarah, is how it demonstrates the importance of staying calm and following protocol even when the call involves your own property. A less experienced dispatcher might have let personal involvement compromise their professional response. Margaret's plea hearing took place 3 weeks after her arrest. She ultimately accepted a deal that involved 6 months of house arrest, community service restitution payments to affected residents, and a permanent prohibition on serving in any HOA or community governance role. She was also required to undergo counseling for what the court psychologist termed authority-seeking behavior. With antisocial characteristics, the judge made it clear during the sentencing that Margaret's pattern of behavior across multiple communities demonstrated a deliberate abuse of trust rather than simple overzealousness about community standards. Homeowner associations serve an important function in maintaining community quality of life. The judge stated, but that authority must be exercised responsibly and within legal boundaries. Using HOA positions to harass and intimidate residents undermines the entire concept of community self-governance as part of her restitution. Margaret was required to write formal apologies to every resident she'd targeted with violation notices or harassment. The letters had to acknowledge that her actions were inappropriate and outside her actual authority. As an HOA board member, Mrs. Patterson showed us Margaret's apology letter when it arrived. It was clearly written by her attorney rather than expressing any genuine remorse, but it did formally acknowledge that the garden gnome violation notice had been issued in error based on an incorrect interpretation of community guidelines. The ripple effects of Margaret's case extended beyond our immediate community. Other HOA boards in the area began reviewing their own procedures and oversight mechanisms. The county started offering workshops on proper HOA governance, and several communities implemented new accountability measures to prevent similar abuse. Sarah finally returned to her regular FBI duties, though she continued to receive occasional calls from residents in other communities who were dealing with similar HOA problems. She'd become something of an inadvertent expert on recognizing and addressing abuse of homeowner association authority. The key thing people need to understand, she explained to a caller from another community, is that HOA board members are volunteers. With very limited legal authority, they can't conduct searches, they can't demand entry to your property, and they certainly can't threaten you with law enforcement action for minor rule violations when someone starts crossing those lines. It's not about community standards anymore, it's about harassment. Our neighborhood settled into a new rhythm over the following months. The HOA board focused on genuine community issues like road maintenance and common area upkeep rather than micromanaging. Individual property choices violation notices were issued only for legitimate problems, and only after attempts at friendly communication had failed. The community garden that Mrs. Patterson had wanted to establish was finally approved and installed. In the common area near the playground, her infamous garden gnome was given a place of honor at the entrance with a small plaque recognizing her patience during the enforcement difficulties of the previous year. Frank's newspaper continued to arrive at whatever time the delivery service found convenient. Without generating any official complaints or violation notices, the young family on Maple Street's children played in their backyard at normal childhood volume levels without their parents, worrying about HOA retaliation. Most importantly, residents felt comfortable approaching the HOA board with concerns or suggestions without fear of becoming targets for harassment. The board meetings that had been dominated by Margaret's lengthy presentations about rule violations and enforcement procedures became normal community discussions about shared interests and concerns. Margaret Henderson had intended to establish herself as the supreme authority over our small corner of suburban life. Instead, her abuse of that authority had resulted in criminal charges, community-wide reforms, and a cautionary tale about the importance of accountability in local governance. Her attempt to use law enforcement as her personal enforcement mechanism had backfired spectacularly when she encountered an actual law enforcement professional who understood the difference between legitimate authority and harassment justice. As it turned out, sometimes comes with a front row seat and a perfect cup of coffee.